Close. Do 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 do. Wah, wah. All right, everyone who isn't here, welcome to the reading of In the Shadow of the Mountain. Yeah, 0 attendees, 0 likes. Yeah, this is going swimmingly. Well, hell, this is just a practice run, anyways. All right, like and subscribe if you love horror. Did Dean Clintock have thoughts? Amber considered if the big dumb jock had more than a Rolodex of 5 insults. From what she could tell, all Dean can do is loosely string together the words fuck, faggot, shit, dick, and bitch into semi-coherent sentences. His IQ was pushing 95 at best, and the idea of him sitting in the woods, thinking, just didn't seem like his modus operandi. To that end, she wondered how she'd let the meandering troglodyte convince her to follow him into the mountains. Amber was prepared for anything at this point. A practical joke, a not-so-practical joke, an even downright motherfucker's gonna bleed joke. Sure, he was captain of the varsity team, and yeah, he was the most popular kid in school, but nothing about that appealed to her. As a matter of fact, they had a sort of understanding. He'd stay away from her, and she wouldn't insult him in ways that forced him to Google the meaning of words. But it was the idea. He wanted her to come with him to a place he'd been going for deep thought. Deep thought. The knuckle dragger was deep in thought. No matter how she tried to rationalize it, it didn't seem likely. Still, he'd seemed so serious. He'd missed multiple practices in the season. Sure, he'd missed multiple classes too, that was normal. But missing practices so late in the season, that was a surefire way for even Dean, the sheriff's son, to get benched. Meaning something had become more important than football. Maybe this was it. Maybe the pressure of being the coolest kid in school, being the sheriff's son, captain of the varsity team, had finally caused the kid to crack. Maybe some of it got through his skull. Maybe he realized he never amounted to anything of value beyond this town, and the most he could hope for was to play professionally, which, given his averages, wasn't very likely. Maybe he'd realized that, likely, he was going to end up his dad's deputy and eventually take over as sheriff. Maybe he'd realized how small he was compared to the rest of the world, growing up in a mountaintop town where the population shrinks from 1,500 people to maybe 70 in the wintertime. It intrigued Amber. Not that Dean Clintock, of all people, might be going through an existential crisis, but that he wanted to share it with her. Frankly, she was just too curious. How far are we climbing, man? Amber steadied her gait, trudging up the dry creek bed that descended from the mountains. Autumn leaves fell around them. This is just the first climb. I said it was far, he answered dismissively. We're going to clear this here rise, and there was an uncomfortable pause. Head up east, another rise into the next ridge. Whoa, whoa, whoa there, cowboy. That's Oliver Town. What Amber referred to as the pet name for the town of Moon. I'm not exactly familiar with the Olivers. It's fine. Dean gave a slight shake of his head, and Amber caught an eye roll out of the corner of his eye. Most of the Oliver boys know me from the league before the league said they had to play for the next county over. We're not close or nothing, but I can come and go as I please, and they don't bother me. Forgive me if I prefer to avoid a dangerous pack of known fornicators and inbred mutants. Amber waved the thought off before proceeding back down the creek. What the shit? For the love of God, they don't have black veins and crab claws. That's actually a callback to an old story of mine, a short story published in Art Post magazine that was called Not in My Country. The hillbillies literally had crab claws and black veins. Dean was clearly cross. You know what? Forget it. I thought you of all people would understand, but you've done nothing but bitch. If you don't want to see, just fuck off back to those damn faggots at the school. Amber fought the urge to play Dean Bingo in her head. All she had to do was get him to say Dick and the scorecard would be complete. She refocused and fought to stop smirking. I'm sorry, she stated simply, turning back around. It's just that's over another hour, and we haven't exactly got great history to date. I know, Dean gestured back up the hill, and Amber did oblige. But the whole thing's some damn joke. You'll get a scholarship, and you'll get the hell out of here and never look back. Even if I get into a third string college on a sports scholarship, what then? I'm not going to be a doctor or a lawyer. Amber's own thoughts poured out of Dean's mouth, almost verbatim. The guy was actually getting it. He was actually having deep revelations. The whole thing threw her off her game. She didn't know what to think or expect. If this was a gag, it was well outside his normal capacity. When was the last time she even saw him so much as pick up a newspaper? Where could this all be coming from? I don't want to be a goddamn cop, Dean continued. There's a whole world out there, and I only get to see this town and maybe spring break in Cancun. I'll waste my time trying to determine if the break-in was a human or a raccoon, then maybe I'll retire and go on a fucking cruise once. Fuck is my life for? Why the fuck am I wasting my fucking time? I've already seen the whole damn thing play out. Fuck that shit. This town can suck my dick. And there it is, Amber thought while she tried not to chuckle to herself. Bingo. And then I found I found it. I found something different. I found a way out. I knew you'd understand. You've been waiting to blow this fucking place your whole life, and this is it. The way out. Dean nodded. He started climbing faster. Far beyond simply intrigued, Amber felt something closer to disbelief. She needed to know what Dean stumbled onto that caused these revelations. She still wasn't comfortable with Oliver Town and certainly didn't want to meet any of the Olivers. Even Dean's dad wouldn't go to Oliver Town. But if Dean knew the Olivers, she was willing to chance it to learn this big secret. The journey continued as the sun climbed with Dean and Amber. Finally, the western climb broke into a ridge and the two could travel easy. Just beyond the ridge was the opening to an old mine. Sweet Jesus, tell me you found an abandoned gold mine. Amber's eyes lit up. His secret could be anything at this point, after all. No! Dean sounded annoyed again, like Amber was missing something obvious. I think it was the Herkimer, but that's not the fucking point. Look, Pa told me a lot of miners from back in the days... Sorry, let me try that again. Look, Pa told me a lot of miners from way back in the days were superstitious. They didn't have no regulations or modern equipment or nothing to keep them healthy. A lot of times, prospectors would start leaning on old witches and shit to help them get rich and stay safe. They get into it too, almost like black magic or some shit, summoning demons and the like. A lot of hillbilly traditions link back to it. Dean proceeded into the mine without hesitation, like he was walking into his house. The notion of doing so herself felt uncomfortable for Amber. He practically disappeared no more than a few yards in, like the darkness had a thickness to it. Yeah, I don't think I'll be going in there, Amber paused. Something nagged at her. Something was off. There was this smell, like a colossal wasp nest. Didn't think you of all people were afraid of the dark. Dean's voice came from inside, echoing in the chambers. It's no more than 20 yards, then it just ends. Come on, you came all this way. Come on back here and see for yourself. There was that nagging sensation, that awful smell, and the impenetrable darkness. Everything about it smacked of danger, but she just had to know. Why else come all this way? And there was the thing that opened Dean's mind. Slowly she moved in, and the darkness enveloped her. Every step forward was a step towards uncertainty. Just up ahead, something moved, something barely perceptible. Amber didn't scream. She didn't have the chance. We got any followers yet? No, nobody. All right, let's just keep going. Chapter 2, The Lake. George pulled up to the sheriff's old Crown Vic. The sheriff was busy hanging posters on a telephone pole caked with wanted signs and missing person signs, and hardly seemed to notice George pull up. Evening, Ossifer! George belted out with glee. He was already a couple in, but in the mountains, during the winter, no one much bothered about driving with a buzz on. Is Kodiak Lake still in operation? I know last year was tight. Tight's putting it mildly. Sheriff Eckel Clintock continued to stroll up and leaned into the passenger side window. But there was a nice government grant for historical properties over a certain acreage, and they managed to pull another couple years. All right, George said with a chuckle. Nothing like a hot cider and a cold beer after some ice fishing. Giddy as a schoolgirl, he did a little dance in his seat as he pulled away. All right now, the sheriff chuckled, glancing over George's hunting rifle and fishing equipment. Before he could drive off, the sheriff leaned in a little more. Do me a favor, keep the drinking down on the roads and stick to the trails with the snowmobiles. Sure thing, Ossifer, George said, continuing to chuckle before he headed down the snowy main drag. George wasn't going to wait for his friends. They could easily find him on the ice. He pulled his Jeep right up to the boat launch and started dragging out ice fishing gear. As he went, he did a little jig, his broad shoulders and stumpy body rolling about in his parka, a bum leg staggering his gait. I'ma catch me a fish, and we'll drink some beer. Me and a fish, a fish, a fish, a fish. This was George's moment of zen. A pop tent, a sterno heater, a tip-up fishing rig, and a beer. By the time his family and friends got there, he dug up a spot, popped a hole in the ice with his auger, and erected a pop tent. He was happy as a pig in shit, as he was fond of saying. 2 empty beer cans already sat by his side. Marco, came a joyful female voice. Come on in, Patty, water's fine. George chuckled. No one sits sober on Kodiak Lake. Grab yourself a beer. Patty obliged, and he continued. So, sis, where's that handsome man of yours? You trying to keep him from me again? You can't go keeping him all to yourself, you know. George referred to his brother-in-law, Bronson. Patty scooched her full-figured frame against her brother for warmth. Well, it's nice to see you too, asshole, she chuckled. Well, where's that hunka mountain of man? He gave his sister a hug and chuckled along with her. Getting the other pop tents and tip-ups, she smiled. And more beer, of course. He whistled. You got it pretty good there with that manservant of yours. Just don't go breaking him. I want me a little bit of that later. George broke into laughter. The next head to pop in was not Bronson's, but had goofy glasses and a scraggly beard, belonging to a close friend named Warren. He rushed in, sat down, and began chugging a beer. After a few silent moments and light chuckles, they exchanged a round of cheering and hugs. God damn it, it's cold, Warren said, cracking open another beer. Let me catch up, it'll help me keep warm. I'm not as padded as George. He cleared the beer in moments. Neither am I, you wuss, Patty chuckled as she watched Warren choke down the second beer. Bronson finally squeezed his large frame into the tiny pop tent, with barely enough room to join the rest. His equipment was over his back, and each hand held a 12-pack. All right, who wants to start digging the next spot? We can cut a little path between the tents and the snow. At that point, a tip-up popped, and the 4 friends cheered. This is going to be a great fucking weekend. Bronson cracked open a beer. The temperature dropped, the wind picked up, and the snow fell. The perfect weather. While a little inconvenient for getting off the ice, as night approached, it was exactly what they were after. Everything was a barren snowscape, perfect for ice fishing and snowmobiling. There is something spiritual about freezing oneself half to death, then warming up fireside with rum-laden cider. The crew brought in their catch of the day. Mother Nature had not been kind. Their first hit was their only hit. A decent-sized pickerel, maybe large enough for a meal for 2 friends or 1 Bronson. The weather also changed for the worst. The wind began to howl, and the snow picked up dramatically. They slogged in off the ice and headed straight for their trucks to unlatch their snowmobiles. They might have been seasoned winter outdoor folks, but no one wanted to trek the 5 miles down the lake to the lodge, especially since snowmobiles were so much damn fun. At this time of year, without the side roads being cleared, snowmobiles were the only way to reach Kodiak Lodge anyways. When George and crew arrived, they discovered a bit of a surprise. The local high school had sprung for the main ballroom, and the halls were infested with well-dressed teenagers. Damn, let's retreat to the bar before they start asking us to slip them beers. Warren shook his head as a large gaggle of young women pushed by. Don't be such a downer, Bronson said, dodging out of the way of yet more teens. We could spike their punch. That's still a thing, right? Spiking the punch? Teenagers will always want to get drunk and high. Nothing's changed since we were kids. Not that much, anyways. Patty sniffed the air. You smell something? George said with a wry smile. Bathroom? She suggested. Bathroom, he agreed, before sneaking up to the bathroom door. He looked back at his group of friends with a wink before turning and kicking open the door. All right, this is the police. I can smell the reefer from the hallway. You're all under arrest. We know you're in here and we know you're doing drugs. Do not try to resist. Teenagers scattered like cockroaches. This was met by a round of laughter from George and crew. Only one young fellow stayed behind. He stared at George, his expression cold. All right, I'm sorry. No need to put on a sourpuss. Just having a little fun, George said with a chuckle. At this point, even a few of the other teens started laughing. Yet, the last one simply wandered out, inspecting George curiously. Come on, Dean, the geezer didn't mean nothing by it. A taller, darker-skinned lad patted the quiet teen's shoulders. Dean continued to look George up and down. Geezer, George scoffed. This was also met by a round of laughter from teens and adults alike. This geezer just pulled one over on you and your friends. The lodge was supposed to be ours, Carlos. Ours for the night, Dean began. I wasn't expecting anyone else to be here. Now, Bronson stepped in. Pretend like we're not here. You kids have fun. Exactly. Sorry for my little stunt. Won't happen again, George added with a pat on young Dean's back. It was tense, though Dean hardly seemed to notice. Well, unless I come up with something really good. More than a little put off by Dean's coldness, George still kept trying to be friendly. Dean, we are expected. A beautiful young woman with dark curly locks stood at the end of the hallway. The two departed without another word. Prom king and queen. The school's dumbest jock and smartest goth. Carlos shook his head. I'll never figure it. He smiled and departed with a shrug. George and crew retreated to the bar, manned only by a single bartender and cook, with not a single patron in the whole establishment. They took up their favorite spots by the Grand View and overlook lake. They took up their favorite spots by the Grand View that overlooked the lake. The weather outside was so inhospitable, anyone who ventured out could get sucked away no more than a few feet from the lodge in a whiteout. If anyone walked outside for so much as a cigarette, they were invited to carry a flare with them. At that moment, someone was stringing up guide ropes to the cars in the parking lot down the lake for snowmobiles to follow. The cars would have to be dug out before anyone could leave, but this time of year, everyone traveled by snowmobile anyways. The crew had theirs parked in the lodge's heated garage. Across the lake, George could make out the reflectors of a winter coat. It was only visible for the briefest of moments as the snow let up. Hey, I think I see someone out there, George pointed into the blinding whiteness. Everyone else just shrugged. No, seriously, I think I see someone. Hey, yeah, I see someone moving. You're seeing things. Patty shook her head. I can't see shit out there, George. Warren squinted into the whiteout. Put your fucking glasses on, dummy. George gave Warren a light tap on the shoulder. Warren obliged. I still don't see shit. Crack a flare, I'm going out. George stood up and headed for the garage. In this? Are you nuts? Patty said, protesting, following close after him. I'll use a guide rope, now spark a flare. I'll see it and head back if I get lost. I'll follow the rope otherwise. Sir, we could call for search and rescue, Clark the bartender added. By the time they get here, he or she could already be dead. George tucked off into the garage with the whole gang, bartender included. Rope, George said, gesturing to Warren, who looped it around his waist. The bartender pulled out his keys and opened the garage door. They were immediately met by a blast of freezing air and a cloud of snow so thick it was like fog. George sparked a flare, as did Bronson. Keep the slack coming. I'm going to shoot as straight as I can for the spot on the ice where I thought I saw them. I can't have you tugging me off the sled. George said, starting the snowmobile. Okay, here we go. In an instant, everything but an iridescent red glow disappeared. George was swallowed up by the snow. Out in the elements, nothing could be seen, and regardless of the parka and goggles, the cold's bite was deep. He drove on, aiming mostly with faith. All he could do was approximate how far onto the lake he saw the figure, and hope that he'd been consistently heading in that direction. Back at the garage, Bronson gave as much slack on the rope as he could. The guide's ropes were frequently used for bad weather like this and can reach all the way across to the trails on the opposing shore. However, George was traveling at a steep angle against the shore, and Bronson had no idea how far they would need to reach. The guide rope uncoiled at an unsettling pace. Every coil that vanished was another 3 feet towards the end, and the end was coming quickly. The tension built as Bronson, Warren, Patty, and Clark watched George's flare fade into the distance. Coil by coil, his lifeline ran shorter and shorter. Then it stopped. The group sighed. George came to a stop and turned back. There was a dull glow from the lodge and a red flare light. Perfect. Not too far out to turn back. He scanned about desperately for signs of life. Hello? He called out. Is anyone there? He waited. In part, he felt stupid for risking whiteout conditions because he might have seen someone on the ice. He needed to be sure and couldn't let it go. What kind of a person would that make me? He thought as he called out again. Hello? He heard a slight whimper, a clear rattling gasp. Something moved a few yards ahead. George aimed the headlights of his snowmobile to reveal the shape with reflecting strips across it. It crawled away from him. He rode up next to it and discovered a person, likely from the lodge, geared up for winter travel, crawling on all fours. Whoever it was shivered and gasped for air. Hey there! Hey buddy, you okay? George dismounted and did his signature hop towards the person, bum leg struggling in the snow. It appeared to be a young man from the high school. He was immediately met with a violent response. The person flopped over and kicked at him. Get away from me! Get the fuck away from me! He said, kicking as he scrambled backwards on his back. Hey now! Hey, easy does it, George said, holding up his hands. You can't be out here, buddy. You're clearly already getting hypothermia. Have to get away from the lodge. They're already there. I have to get away, the young man said. Who's at the lodge? I gotta take you back, kid. You'll die out here. George reached down to help him up. He knocked George's hand out of the way. You don't get it. If we go back, we're dead or worse. They could kill us all. He stood up, shaking violently. We could take your snowmobile. We could get out of here. We can live. Jesus Christ, kid, what on God's green earth are you talking about? George said, deeply confused. Something had spooked the kid. Was it cabin fever, too much pot, or something else? The wintry conditions could really play tricks on the mind. That and enough of the kind leaf could make the wrong mind paranoid. At that moment, something passed through the headlights of George's snowmobile. He spun around. It was hard to see the snowmobile now, and the lodge was gone from sight. From the corner of George's eye, he saw something move, just out of the flare light. They fucking followed you! The kid panicked and scrambled away in the snow. George immediately chased after him. Wait, kid! We'll be prying your body off the ice tomorrow! But within seconds, the kid had vanished. George stopped and called out, Kid! Kid! Suddenly he heard screaming from beyond the flare light. He ran towards it, but the sound moved away from him faster than his hop could manage in the deep snow. He saw nothing in the dull crimson glow of the flare, and soon the screaming faded into the distance. Something brushed by, again almost imperceptible to George. He spun about, holding the flare up. There was this stink, like a wasp nest. Kid! He called out. Slowly he began making his way back to the snowmobile. Kid! He called out again. Something brushed by again. This time there was more substance to it. Though if George could summon the words, they would merely be big and black. He felt like he was surrounded. The stink lingered, even in the frosty air. He mounted up and circled a couple of times. There was nothing. The kid was gone, as though something had snatched him up and carried him off. But there were no tracks to follow. In the fallout, even George's fresh snowmobile tracks were nearly buried. He felt a sudden tug on his guideline. Before he knew it, he was yanked off the snowmobile and dragged backwards. He fought to pull to regain his feet, but he slid helplessly, unable to get his good leg under him. And the force pulling him was strong, stronger than he could resist. Within moments, the area around him began to light up, and he soon realized he was nearing the lodge. He called out and waved his flare. The tugging stopped, and finally George got back on his feet. Bronson immediately met him in the garage. God damn it, man, I almost had him, but something... George took a few deep breaths. Why did you have to pull me back? I almost had him. We lost sight of you, you fucking bastard. Patty punched him in the chest. We can try again, Bronson offered. The hell we will, Patty said, pushing her husband lightly. Something got him, maybe a bear, something got the kid. George shook his head, feeling completely defeated. I'll have search and rescue on the lake tomorrow. We'll find his body eventually, Clark said with a somber tone, adding a simple nod. George, you tried. That's more than any of us were willing to do. You're a damn hero. Don't much feel like it. That kid's still dead, George replied with a shake of his head. I think he was one of the kids from prom. Jesus, what do we tell them? What could you have done? Patty hugged her brother and brushed snow off his parka. If it was a bear, all you could do was frighten it off. Don't start beating yourself up. You don't understand, Patty. I had him. If I had just grabbed him, shit, I could have thrown him over my shoulder or something. I don't know. Like what, George? Warren chimed in. Once your flare disappeared, we gave you exactly 1 minute. Any longer than that, we'd be reeling in a George-sicle. I could have done something, George protested, frustrated and angry. Jesus, George, you're bleeding. Patty pulled her hand away to notice she just smeared blood across his shoulder. Your back. Clark drew everyone's attention to a clean hole in the goose-down coat, blood trickling from it. George pulled off his coat. Whatever it was made it clear through his coat, his sweater, his undershirt, and left a puncture wound right in the fat of his shoulder. Jesus, that's going to need stitches, Clark observed. This isn't a bear. This looks like a damn scorpion. What happened out there? Patty said, aghast. I don't know. Something brushed up against me. Could have been the kid. He might have panicked and drawn a weapon or something. I don't know. There was something else out there. If it wasn't a bear, I don't know what. George threw his wildest guess at her question. Well, I have emergency training for this reason. Let me get you cleaned up and I'll dress the wound, Clark offered. I just want you to know I'm not covered by most HMOs. The group was able to chuckle, but the moment felt empty. Clearly, most felt awkward for laughing at all. Their friend had, likely, just witnessed a kid get mauled to death. Chapter 3. Due to the lack of business, thanks to the snow squall, Clark was able to put the group up for the night free of charge, so George could heal. They split 2 attached rooms and bunked down to wait for the storm. For the moment, they could rest in relative peace, though George had to sleep on his stomach. In the morning came a loud rapping at the door of Warren and George's room. Warren woke with a start. George covered his head with his pillows. The knock repeated. Warren staggered to his feet and fought a cloud of haze to focus on the loud banging. Given last night's event, Warren wasn't surprised that someone was knocking on his door so early in the morning. But sleep deprivation, coupled with a mild hangover, made for a world of confusion. He struggled to put his glasses on. Please open up. This is Sheriff Clintock, Adirondack Sheriff's Department. I need to speak to a George McGinnis. The sheriff's words brought Warren round to the world again. Right. Warren muttered to himself as he staggered over to George. Up, buddy. Sheriff's probably going to want a statement or something. He nudged him with his foot. George hissed in pain. I swear to God, Wedgie. He used Warren's nickname, but his voice held a clear tone of anger. I'll put you right through that goddamn window. He fought to sit up, His his wounds were stiff and a little crusty. Mr. McGinnis, if you please. Another knock came through the door. George begrudgingly limped over without his leg brace and opened the door a crack. Warren curled back up in bed. The sheriff looked in at George, and this time did not have the same pleasant look as the day before. Good morning, Ossifer. How can I be of service? George said pleasantly. I need to get your statement over the disappearance of Kenny Allard. George's pleasantries had no effect on the sheriff's stone face. George nodded. Of course. Why don't we have a seat downstairs in the lodge? I'll buy you a coffee. The coffee was free, of course, and the sheriff didn't seem to find George's joke funny. Just give me a moment to get dressed. George met with the sheriff and gave his statement. He left out the part where he thought the kid might have taken a stab at him and shrugged the wound off as part of a bear attack. He simply couldn't think of a saner explanation. You say you saw the bear? The sheriff asked, taking notes. No, but I can't figure what else could carry away a full-grown man and leave a large wound in my shoulder, George stated. Oh, there we go. Kids said they were going to kill us all. Not who. Way I see it, he snuck a smoke behind the chaperone's back, probably out by the dumpster. Maybe a couple large brown bears were getting a snack. The kid panics, runs for the hills, gets caught in the whiteout, ends up on the lake. And you saw him on the lake? The sheriff asked. Yes, I saw him there. I went out to the lake to get him. I found him in the snow, but then he got away from me, George explained. He got away from you? The sheriff looked up from his notes. He was panicked, trying to get far away from the lodge as possible. He was out of his mind, fighting me so I couldn't take him back. George's anger and frustration was rising. He felt as if the sheriff's tone was getting accusatory. I tried to grab him, but he was so panicked he ran off into the fucking snow and likely got himself killed. George thumped the table. You think that isn't going to haunt me for the rest of my damn life? I could have saved that kid. The sheriff held up his hands. Easy there, Mr. McGinnis. I have to get all the facts. There's going to be a lot of questions why a kid went missing at prom, and you're the only one to see him before he vanished. We got no tracks, no blood from an attack, no evidence of a struggle or wild animal. The damn snow just covers everything up. We might not find him until the thaw, and until then, we have his parents to answer to. George nodded. He spent a lot of time feeling sorry for himself and didn't even consider how the kid's parents were suffering. I'm sorry, it's just, I could have done something. You know, if I could have just grabbed him. I don't think I'm the only person to tell you this, but there is nothing you could have done. So let me explain it in a way that might make sense. The squall has cleared up, the sun is shining, the temperature has risen, and our search and rescue team have already exhausted most of their capacity trying to find the missing kid. You did what paid professionals go through years of training to do, and you got luckier than most frequently are. What's more, you survived it, and with all the forces of nature against you. I'm sorry I was giving you a hard time, it's just the nature of the job. George nodded again. He was done feeling sorry for himself. Thanks, you don't know how much that helps. Figured it might. You take care now. And thanks for the coffee. The sheriff seemed to force a smile and finally accepted the punchline of George's free coffee joke. George lit up a bit and moved over to the lodge where breakfast was served. The room was filled with teenagers, half hungover, the other half strung out from sugar crash. They polished off nearly the entire buffet, save for a couple dry sausages and some overcooked, waterlogged ration eggs. He shook his head and scraped up what he could. He pulled up a chair at a table, intent on sitting by himself. But within seconds, Carlos from the night before sat down in front of him. George smiled pleasantly, though he just wanted to be left alone. I heard what you tried to do for Kenny. Thank you. Carlos' words softened George up quickly. He hadn't considered himself worthy of thanks. You may not know this, but that wasn't the only one that went missing last night. You kidding me? Did you tell the sheriff? George was almost shocked. That, Carlos looked for the right words, might not be a good idea. What are you getting on about? What if they're still alive? Search and rescue needs to get after them, George said, empathizing how serious the circumstances were. He was frankly beyond surprised that Carlos wouldn't just go directly to the sheriff anyways. Look, last 3 weeks, not including the 5 that went missing last night, there have been. He fought for the right words to explain, to explain, and nervously looked around. Something more, something more than missing kids had spooked him. Other disappearances. What are you saying? George asked dumbly, wanting desperately to understand. Some of them come back like they just went for a casual stroll, after having been missing after having been missing for days without explanation. But not everyone comes back, and the disappearances are increasing, Carlos explained. And that's just kids, some adults too. Including the sheriff? George was still confused, but he could guess where this might be going. Including the sheriff. Frustrated, Carlos knitted his fingers together and leaned forward on his elbows. He was gone for a couple days, then all of a sudden he just showed back up again like nothing had happened. So I told him the most rational thing I could. I said someone was grabbing up kids and killing the adults that knew about it. He treated me like I was hysterical. Regardless of people still missing, he brushed me off without a second thought. So what? There's some conspiracy and the sheriff's in on it? George rubbed his face, trying to force himself to think clearly. Are you listening to me? People disappearing? The sheriff knows about it and couldn't give less of a fuck? Carlos kept his voice down, but hammered his point with his finger into the table. All right, easy, kid. Look, tell me what you can. Maybe I can collaborate your story with the sheriff. You're not getting it. Whatever it is, the sheriff is protecting it, Carlos explained flatly. And there's more. I think I've seen one. Seen one? Seen what? George chuckled. Are we talking Bigfoot? Thanks. Thanks a fucking lot. I thought after what you've been through, you might understand, Carlos snarked. You're worse than the damn sheriff. He stood up and ready to storm off. I tell you kids go missing, the sheriff could give a fuck, and none of that seems wrong to you? And the fucking smell, like ammonia, fuck, I don't know what. Those words gripped George deeply. He held his hands up defensively, trying to calm Carlos. Slowly, he placed them palms down on the table inside. It smelled like a big fucking wasp nest. Yeah, Carlos replied. George thought for a moment. He might as well hear the kid out. Even if Carlos was letting his imagination run wild, George guessed that he might be onto something. Okay, take Trail 12 to the Cabin 8. We can talk. We don't have to bring this to the sheriff. Maybe the state boys can help. If there was something provable, they could take it to the cops. Maybe it could redeem his failure from last night. Carlos nodded at George. He looked around almost as if to see who was watching and then wandered off. Warren came down from the room and just barely saw the end of George's exchange with the team. Carlos and Warren made brief and uncertain eye contact. What the hell was that all about? Warren muttered under his breath as he sat down with George. Kid thinks he knows something about what happened last night. He wants to talk to me about it up at the cabin later, George said casually. He didn't want Warren to think there was something wrong with the kid. Christ, he doesn't think you had something to do with it, does he? Warren asked. Nothing like that. He thinks he's seen a pattern in some local disappearances that might be linked to last night. Says the sheriff doesn't want to listen to him. Hopes I collaborate with him. George looked up and saw Dean staring at them. His gaze was less cold now and more sinister. His deep look of malcontent pierced George, grating him to the bone. They locked eye contact, and George certainly didn't mind giving it right back. Warren noticed the exchange and said, Got a problem, son? You know this man nearly died trying to save your friend. Least you could do is try to be grateful. Dean tossed his plate on the table and stormed off. Shit. George felt about 10 inches tall, and the whole room was staring at them. That wasn't the right way to handle that. I gotta stop acting like I'm the victim here. These kids lost their friend. George averted his eyes, more than just embarrassed. I'm gonna do what I can to make it right with Carlos. At the very least, I can try. Hey, buddy, come on. What you went through wasn't easy. I can't imagine how I'd feel if it was me. No one can understand what you're going through. But I can buy you some beer. Warren tried to comfort his friend the only way he knew how. George chuckled. All right, save your hair of the dog for later. Let's grab the gear and get back up to the trails. Go round up Bronson and Patty. Chapter 4? Is this chapter 4? They're not numbered. Neither are the pages. Look. Like no chapter number and no page numbers. Is anybody even in this? No, still nobody. All right, whatever. Let's keep going. The cabin was barely more than 2 rooms with a loft, but it had a blazing wood stove that could sweat anyone out into the frigid night, and a little kitchenette which provided a sense of civilization. It even had a shower on the deck if anyone was willing to shower in freezing temperatures. An outhouse sat 20 feet away, with a set of deer antlers adorning the arch of the door. The cabin even had electricity. A generator could run the cooler and all the lights for 3 days with their current supply of gas. Just downhill, slightly from their place, was a small pond fed by a clear mountain creek. It was frozen over and covered with snow, but in the spring it was good for trout fishing. Now George was in nothing more than his long johns. He sat comfortably stove-side with his beer, feet up and warming. He and the crew had come in from a day of snowmobiling and dining in the town. He had a tray of cheese and cured meat by his side. The stress of the night before had almost completely melted away. But George knew Carlos would be along soon, and while he tried not to let it sour his buzz, it did hang on his mind as though with grappling hooks. The light of the snowmobile flashed his cabin, letting him know that Carlos was approaching. He grumbled, but he invited this beast into his life, so he had to deal with it. He pushed himself up and brought his snacks back to the cooler. A few rhythmic knocks came from the door. Come in, but be quiet. George motioned to Carlos to enter and pointed to the bunks, signifying people were in them. Carlos looked around, taking in the cabin. At that moment, Warren popped his head up. The fuck? Go back to bed, Wedgie, George said flatly. Nope, Warren said, swinging his feet off the bunk. I'm off for a piss. George shook his head at him and as he fussed to collect his boots, lantern, and coat. Don't mind him. George grabbed the beer and shook it at Carlos. So what have you got for us, kid? Carlos ignored the beer and watched Warren leave. A high school kid turning down the chance to sneak a beer seemed odd to George. Even stranger was the kid's general demeanor. He seemed rigid, moving almost robotically. Once Warren was out, he slowly turned and gazed back towards George, but said nothing. Okay, George pulled up a seat next to the table. Why don't we start with recently? Carlos didn't move. He took his eyes off George and seemed to examine the cabin more, like he was going over the details of its structure in his mind. Just outside, Warren took large bounding steps in what must have been 2 feet of snow. Slowly he trudged forward. His sure goal was the outhouse. Every step was a race against time to get into the bathroom. It would also be marginally warmer in the latrine. It wasn't heated, but it would be out of the direct wind. Out of the corner of Warren's eye, he saw something stir in the trees. He spun about, nearly falling in the snow. There was a slight glistening in the lantern light, as though the light was bouncing off a mass of orbs in the trees. To be safe, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a can of bear mace. In the deep Adirondack bush, it was used for the usual things that went bump in the night. Back inside the cabin, George and Carlos stared uncomfortably at each other, as if they were about to draw at high noon. Something was off. George wondered if he'd managed to offend the young man, but was also becoming cross. Look, kid, I know this isn't what you came here to hear, but I gotta tell you, I'm usually a pretty private man. I'm not much for this stuff. You gotta start talking to me or you might as well leave, George said bluntly, trying to be as gentle as he could, given his frustration. Carlos moved to the side and opened the cabin door behind him without looking. It seemed he'd opted to leave, and George prepared an apology for snapping at the kid. As George went to speak, Warren staggered in through the open door. The smell of piss and shit and sourness like a wasp hive followed him into the cabin. Warren's mouth was agape, his head contorted unnaturally, and his movements were jerky and tremoring. Even stranger, his neck was goiterous and undulating. George shot up out of his seat and tried to comprehend what he was seeing. He attempted to respond, but his mind just ran in circles. "Patty! Bronson!" George finally belted out. In a moment, Patty and Bronson were down from the loft. George hobbled to Warren's side, almost ignoring Carlos, but shooting him a dirty look as he moved in. "Wedgie, what's the matter? Talk to me." Carlos casually walked up behind George and threw him in a Marine's chokehold. George might have been on the short side, but he could easily lift his weight, even with that damn bum leg. He threw his shoulder into Carlos while trying to loop a hand into the hold, but found the boy had incredible strength. Warren turned to face George as he continued to struggle helplessly with Carlos, giving him a clear look inside Warren's mouth. A bundle of tendrils squirmed about inside. There was no tongue, no teeth, no discernible palate. Like most of his head had been hollowed out down to the bone. Bronson didn't know what was happening, but he knew someone was strangling his friend. He ran up and tried to force Carlos off George. Despite his stature, Bronson was not much stronger than George. The two of them began to turn the tables on Carlos, but not with certain ease. Patty rushed to Warren, assuming he was injured. He reached out and latched onto her with a vice-like grip. Patty was no soft woman either and began wrestling with Warren's rigged body. She had an easier time with Warren alone than the two men had with Carlos. Before anyone could gain control of the situation, the lights went out and the generator outside started making a grinding metal-on-metal sound. The group was left scrapping in the orange glow of the stove. Time was lost, counted only by the flicker of firelight, but George and his friends knew time was short. Bronson finally managed to pry Carlos from George, and George spun around to assist with taking the team down. Patty managed to put Warren face down on the ground, though he thrashed like a malfunctioning washing machine. Before Patty knew it, Warren's head popped off. Warren's head did not roll as expected. It flopped side to side like one of those wobbling children's toys, making a god-awful squishing noise of meat and blood as it went. Jesus Christ! Almost in shock, George tried to maintain control of Carlos. Bronson threw up and let go, while Patty jumped off Warren's body and backed up to the wall. Carlos threw George to the ground and ran out the door. George hadn't fully recovered when he looked up and saw a cluster of glossy orbs staring at him through the window. Just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished. His whole world started to shrink. He staggered to get back up on his good leg. Between the gruesome presentation of his friend's head and whatever he'd just witnessed outside, it was a struggle to stay conscious. While George was distracted with what he saw through the window, Bronson and Patty watched Warren's head come to life. What looked like a tail with a stinger uncoiled from the neck, several squirming appendages pushed through the face, as well as out the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. They limply lifted up the head and turned to face Bronson and Patty. Bronson vomited again, while Patty froze in place. They heard a slight crunching sound coming from the forehead. The forehead caved inward, and the cluster of shiny black orbs forced their way to the surface. Regaining his composure, George bolted for the gun cabinet and began pulling out rifles and shotguns. He tossed a Mossberg to Patty and pulled up a rifle for himself and Bronson. "The fuck is that thing?" Patty said before checking the chamber to make sure Patty said before checking the chamber to make sure shells were ready. The three friends stood there trying to muster a reaction. Outside, something started playing on their nerves. A scratch came at one window, then another, then the patio door, then even the skylighting on the roof. Shuffling was heard all along the walls and even on the roof. Bronson looked around, as did George, the two spinning wildly. Patty never took her eyes off of Warren's head. It just looked back at her. The glossy cluster of black orbs atop Warren's head must have been eyes, even if they looked like roe. "Fuck it," Patty snapped out of it, took an unsteady aim, and blew the things into chunky ribbons that streaked across the floor. Bronson tried to get his head back in the game. "Everyone back to back." They obliged as he took the rifle from George. They obliged as he took the rifle from George. Fuck. What do you think they are? Patty said, looking around at the walls, windows, and ceiling, her nerves on edge. Whatever they are, they clearly don't like bullets. George gestured at what was left of Warren's head. A large, dark mass blew through the patio doors with a loud crash. Everyone turned and opened fire aimlessly, unsure what they were even shooting at. Before anyone could turn around, the window in the kitchenette shattered inward, and another dark mass burst through. Then another came through the skylight, and another on the opposing wall of the kitchenette. The group opened fire, desperately pushing against each other's back, hoping each was alive and providing support. Need rounds, Bronson cried out. George passed a magazine behind him, only taking his hand away from the trigger long enough to do so. I'm out, Patty shouted. She took a knee and fumbled more shells into her shotgun. The fuck are these things? Bronson screamed out over the gunfire, hardly intelligible to the other two. As the question was rhetorical, no one answered. No one could make out anything in the flashes of gunfire. We gotta find safety, Patty demanded, hoping someone had a plan. Loft, George called out. Grab more ammunition from the cabinet. Patty swept by the other two and dove into the cabinet for boxes of rounds. She hurriedly scooped up as many as her arms would hold, trying her best to keep the shotgun tucked under her pits. There was no window next to the stairs, though it was close to the skylight, and every odd second George nervously aimed at it. They slowly backed up the stairs, Patty keeping an eye open on the loft, in case something got up there. She wouldn't be able to shoot it, but she could at least warn the boys. Tell me you left your phone on the damn bed, Patty barked at Bronson. I don't know, Bronson yelled back, panicked. Watch the loft, I'll watch the window, Patty barked again. Let's hope these things can't eat through the walls. Upstairs, George and Bronson had a perfect vantage point over most of the cabin, save the kitchenette. Patty quickly dropped boxes of rounds for them, still eyeballing the loft's window, then took a knee and started loading her shotgun. A shadow rushed across the window. She knew she didn't have long. Chambering a shell, she scrambled for her husband's phone, hoping it would still be there. Finding it, she dialed 911. Not the sheriff, George called out between the shots. Fine, the state boys. Hell, the goddamn military. Patty didn't argue. She had no idea what George might know and didn't really care. Patty placed the phone on speaker and threw it into the nightstand, still focused on the window to the loft. Even if she couldn't communicate with the emergency operator, the sound of gunfire should do enough talking. Something forced its way through the loft window, and it didn't even make it fully through before it was sent back by the force of gunshot. A muffled, staticky voice came over the phone. Patty couldn't make out what it said and didn't give a rat's ass when she responded. Help! Lot 8, Kodiak Mountain Preserve! She didn't care to explain. She just kept repeating the message as she plugged a couple more rounds through the window of the loft. Within moments, the dark masses creeping about the cabin were no longer visible, and the shooting ceased. The tense silence was only broken by the ringing in everyone's ear. It was nearly an hour before George and Bronson lowered their guns. Nearly an hour after that before Patty begrudgingly agreed to lower hers. The three huddled together in the corner of the loft, aiming at the slightest flicker of light from the stove. All they could do was sit and wait and hope that the next thing to walk through the cabin doors was the cops. Why not the sheriff? Patty said, wide-eyed, just trying to break the insufferable silence. Long story short, he could be in on it, George replied, unsure of how to tell them what he knew. Was Carlos in on it originally and trying to convince George not to go for help? He had been trying to tell George what was going on, only to be affected by it after? Neither made sense with more information. What was it anyways? It was hard to know who to trust, but that might have been Carlos's intention all along. Waiting seemed to take all night, but with their nerves on edge, a second seemed like an hour. Minute after agonizing minute, they waited unsure of what to do. The space between their breaths started to increase. Every breath broke with a longer wait for the next as time dragged on. Then they heard the distant thump of helicopter blades and the buzzsaw zip of snowmobile engines. Soon a spotlight swept across the cabin, and the blue strobes of emergency lights flickered against the firelight. The tense breath of the three turned into exhausted sighs of relief. Hot damn, here they come. George squeezed Bronson's hand. He squeezed back as tightly as he could, which was nearly crushing. Patty broke into tears before belting out, "Yeehaw!" At that moment, a pack of state cops burst in. They filled out the cabin, announcing themselves with a typical authoritarian command. The group declared their position and threw down their arms. It was difficult to explain the situation to the cops, but by agreeing to a search and remaining calm, they convinced the troops to take them to the hospital as opposed to jail. Given the circumstances, the state boys were apt to treat them more like criminals than victims. Everything was riddled with bullet holes. There was a headless man, and from a quick, untrained observation, it could seem like his head was blown off by a shotgun. But there were a few things that corroborated their story. The windows and the doors were clearly blown inward, and someone had taken a fire axe to the generator. After that, convincing the skeptical officers that this was a home invasion gained traction. So the group was loaded up into the chopper and heli-lifted to the closest hospital. All right, I think I'm going to cut it off there. Nobody ever joined. That's all right. I'm going to start trying to make a regular point of doing these lives. If you want to listen to the full audiobook or buy a copy of In the Shadow of the Mountain, it's of course in the description below, so just go check those out. The links are included. Thank you and pleasant nightmares. Wait, how do you stop these things? I have no idea how to stop those. Nope, that's share. We don't want. I'm just gonna hit this X button and see what happens. Boop. Boop. Are you sure you want to stop streaming? Okay.